Today I'm celebrating the birthday, but I suppose also remembering the death of my older brother, Duncan John Powell. It's funny, I spoke the eulogy at his funeral, and so in some ways I've already done this, but it felt wrong in a way not to include him in this series of Genius Tree videos, because even though my older brother was someone that in some ways caused me a lot of pain, he was someone who also taught me a great deal, and for which I shall be eternally grateful. So I want to take a moment to celebrate his particular genius. My older brother was born on the 17th of April, which makes him does that make him an Aries? Or does that make him a Taurus? Hey, yeah, he's an Aries, full of fire. And on top of that, he also happens to have been born under the Chinese astrology of the fire horse. Something which he never forgot or let anybody else forget. Because in the Chinese tradition, the young boys, I believe especially if the year of the fire horse, which is something which comes round because you have wooden horses and water horses, and so I think it comes round about every 70 years, the children of the fire horse were all killed, or at least the boys were, because as the story goes, they were so much trouble and not for this world. So they were terminated at birth. That's how I've always remembered the story as recounted by my older brother. And he, I think, kind of felt some injustice for the fact that he hadn't actually been terminated at birth. That then the rest of his life was kind of his culture's fault for not having got rid of him. Like he'd had to really tolerate life. And he had a lot of axes to grind and a lot of chips on his shoulder, and that was one story that he embraced around the story of his life from the very onset of it. He resented me very much because I came along when he was about 10, and he had his heart set on becoming a speedway rider. It's a form of motorbike race that my family were always into, and he was already very much into bicycles and motorbikes. My father was a mechanic and an engineer, and he was determined that he was going to become a speedway rider. And so then when I appeared, and then my little brother, that absolutely dashed any hopes that he had of being able to see the family invest in what would be a very expensive hobby or pastime. So that kind of ruined his life there again, and he had to go to school, which he really didn't like, and he was pursued by teachers, which he really didn't like, and he became an autodidact. He taught himself many things, and also a very autonomous being from an early age. He really didn't get on with school. I remember him continually going on about Mr. Slack and other teachers, Mr. Scout, that used to upset his life from Long Sands Community or Long Sands School in St. Neots. And I think he was about 13 years old when he had his first encounter with drugs. Not the easiest way into that world, although he loved it apparently, because as just a 13-year-old boy, he had his first dose of LSD, which is a very strong psychedelic, and I think for him, he never looked back. He absolutely loved it. And it's funny because he was always very careful about warding me off drugs and away from drugs. So when I was about 8, I think it was about 8 or 9, he moved into a place in the countryside not far, with his girlfriend and some other friends, not far from where we lived, and I started cycling out to see them. And I used to love going to see my older brother because first of all it was a good adventure on the bikes, and then when I got there I would always be welcome. There was nice people, they were all older than me, 10 years or so older than me, and they were into motorbikes and music and gardening and interesting things, and they used to listen to me. His girlfriend was always a great friend to me. She would really listen to my heartaches and talk, she was someone I could talk to about girls and about the affairs of the heart. And my older brother introduced me to so much amazing music. I went to my first gig with him, which was when I was about 13. I elected to go and see The Fall with him. We jumped in the back of a van and went off to Cambridge, and it was in the course of that ride to Cambridge that someone who didn't know the situation with me, i.e. keep all drugs away from my younger brother, someone passed me a spliff in the back of a van, and I had my first introduction to drugs at the age of 13, except at least mine was just a spliff. I remember having an absolutely incredible experience that night, and that changed the way I perceived music and life radically. Some people, like my parents, would have thought that was the beginning of my downfall. But my older brother, he really formed me in so many ways. He was somewhat of a father figure because he actually listened to me, talked to me in a way that was very frank and honest. My parents, bless them, were very, very sheltered from the realities of the world. They lived their life vicariously through the Daily Mail and through what they saw on BBC TV and acceptable television programmes. They'd never really thought outside the box in any way whatsoever. So, they were limited in how they could talk to me about the realities of life. But my older brother, he always really spoke to me very honestly. And one of the things that he did, he really did try to dissuade me from pursuing the route of taking drugs in every way he could. Although honestly, when I finally was introduced to the power of marijuana in its ability to affect the appreciation of music and life and creativity in many ways, he then was like, well, you just definitely want to keep away from these drugs, do not get into heroin, do not get into amphetamines, do not get in, and give me in-depth, explanations of why not and how not. And I remember one time that he got me to watch The Filth and the Fury, which is a Julian Temple documentary of the Sex Pistols. And he actually did two documentaries on the Sex Pistols. The first one was The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which was paid for by Malcolm McLaren, which he later kind of regretted making because he discovered that it was given a very, very one-sided, very slanted perception of the story of the Sex Pistols. And later on, I believe he was persuaded by or through John Lydon to give a very different portrait, and that became The Filth and the Fury. And it begins in the 1970s, showing what punk grew out of, the deprivation, the miners' strike, all of the stuff that was going on in all the strikes, the general strikes that were going on in the UK in the 70s, the rubbish piled up in mountains in the streets, and how the punks basically, were almost, it wasn't, it's just like, well, we're going to do it for ourselves, through ourselves, by ourselves. We can teach ourselves these instruments. We can do it in a way that we believe. We're not waiting for anyone to save us. And the Sex Pistols were a powerful voice. And it's a really sad story. There's a moment in it where John Lydon, the lead singer, Johnny Rotten, breaks down in tears because of his choice to invite his best friend into the band, who later, Sid Vicious, who later dies of a heroin overdose. And he realised that, the fame was too much for him. He wasn't ready to cope with that sort of thing. And basically drugs destroyed the life of his best friend. And his best friend was invited into the band by him. He felt extremely responsible. And I remember my brother watching this video with me, and me feeling really, oh my God, it was very powerful. I'm never going near any of that stuff. So it was a special irony that later on in life, after his own heartbreaks, my older brother ended up falling into heroin, and then after that, loads of prescription medications from drugs, and he just had a very, very, very difficult way out in the latter part of his life. And when he finally died, I was one of the first people to go into the flat after it had its initial cleaning, and it was it was really a very depressing state of affairs. I put my hands on the window handles to open the windows, get some air in, open the curtains, and it was clear that the windows hadn't been opened in a very long time. My handprint was left in the grease and the dirt so he had been sealed into this place. And it also turned out, so he hadn't had the curtains open, he hadn't had the windows open for a very long time. In the kitchen there was just racks and racks and racks of baked beans and potatoes and a freezer full of sausages. That was what he was eating basically every day. Sausages, baked beans and potatoes, and he saved his money in order to be able to do all his creative projects. And it might sound like I'm not really celebrating his genius here, but I'm kind of, I want to explain his genius, his unique style and talent, kind of against the backdrop of what can happen when someone's life goes wrong or is full of challenges or basically becomes a very dark thing, and yet still that genius can be scintillating somewhere in there. There's this sparkle. My brother upset so many people in the course of his lifetime that he was a very solitary figure towards the end of his life. And he still had friends, and he still would do anything for anyone in his mind, but he certainly helped people. He certainly would support those people that were in favour at a particular time. In those last years, he had built 3D printers, 3D CNC lathes, and milling machines in his little council flat. He'd built huge work benches, and he could solder. And in fact, a really beautiful story in a way from the start of his life was that because of having been in the garage with my dad and learnt about bikes, he got a job in a bike shop, became really, really good at that. Then he got into building motorbikes and got a job working in a motorbike shop, and then ended up building his own motorbike when I believe he completed that when I believe he was 15. So he was still too young to even get a motorbike license, but he had built this beast of a 750 GPZ, which I will try to post on this video somewhere, and probably be the thumbnail. And of course he couldn't keep off it and had very little respect for the law, and in fact one day was about to be pulled by the police when he still didn't have his license, was, as far as they were concerned, driving recklessly, and a police chase ensued which involved multiple cars. There was an enormous list of offences: going the wrong way up one-way streets, and wheeling and reckless driving and speeding and going through no entry signs, going through traffic lights, not stopping for, it was just this massive list of stuff. But he got away. I say that with some kind of celebration. I don't know if that's really a good thing, but it is a testament to his speed, skill, ingenuity. He managed to get away, hide away, and apparently was in tears watching the police wheel away his bike, and he couldn't resist going back for it, tried to pretend that it had been stolen, went back to claim his bike, and then it was about 4 years later when finally the police came for him, middle of the night, arrested him, took him away to a youth detention centre where he spent 6 months, then spent his 21st birthday in that detention centre. And that was another significant event that really marked his life. He felt that was very unfair, and there wasn't any. He claimed there was no warning, and he didn't feel like he'd really actually done anything wrong. He hadn't hurt anybody, and from that point on, his life, he got into dealing drugs. He got into I don't even know all the things that he got into. I know that later on in his life, someone did him wrong on eBay, sent him the wrong product, and he then smashed it up and sent it back to them, and that ended up in a massive fight, and he ended up going back to prison again. God knows what went on in the full nitty-gritty of that story. And, and I know from personal accounts that he hurt a lot of other people, like emotionally and physically. And so he was a very angry, discontented soul, probably exacerbated not just by his, birth sign or being a fire horse, but, by lack of sleep, by lack of decent nutrition, and the effects of taking drugs, not just illegal drugs, but the years and years where he was taking drugs prescribed to him from the doctor. And I remember, oh God, he would come for Christmases and family events, and there were times where he passed out on the floor under the table, because for him to cope with being around the parents and around all these straight people, he would have to medicate himself in order to do that. But then, despite all of this stuff, he had this incredible genius. Like, he collected puzzle boxes, Chinese intricately built puzzle boxes, or Japanese, I think, and could do them all, and was just amazing at solving puzzles. He had this incredible engineering skill. He could build and repair bikes and cars, and he could solder, work with electrics. He just was he was so ingenious in his use of technology and being able to work things out for himself. And of course, when the internet came along, that meant he could do and learn almost anything. Now, later on, he got into history and alternative histories, and he was one of those people who at the end of his life was then taking great delight in upsetting people, in talking about the holocaust. Now, I did see stuff that he shared that definitely shows some cracks in the story, in the commonly accepted historical narrative of the Holocaust. But for him to then start complaining that the whole thing, or asserting that the whole thing was a hoax, was ridiculous. And kind of, it's quite amazing, because he had Jewish friends in his earlier life, and came to just say awful things about the Jews, and it was really embarrassing to be around him at family gatherings sometimes, and very painful, because he was so provocative and didn't have anything to lose, and would just say the most outrageous things. I don't know if he even believed them, but he certainly liked playing that role of pariah. So my brother had a checkered story, and despite the pain that I've personally felt through being related to him, and there was a moment when he completely abandoned me, even though I'd looked at him as like being this father figure for about 10 years or so through my teenage years. There was this moment where he just disowned me, and it was very, very painful, and took a long time to get over, and I tried to reach out to him on numerous occasions. And the one interesting thing was that in the very last time I saw him, he seemed to be getting himself together. He related to my children beautifully that day in a very positive and uncharacteristic way, and showed warmth and tenderness and humour. And I must say that his humour stayed with him throughout. even through the more difficult phases, there were moments when he would come out with things that would just crack everybody up. He was a very funny man, despite all of the darkness. So I hope that this paints a picture of someone who is troubled, had a lot of struggles and stuff, and yet even within all of that, I can absolutely see his unique genius. You know, it was beautiful discovering his box of photos after his life and images of him jumping around on motorbikes and pulling wheelies. And, you know, he was, I think, amongst his group of friends, always the guy that could do that crazy thing and go that bit further. And, you know, he was a unique, very, very funny, very lovable person. And I suppose, again, I hope this story manages to convey not just the beauty of someone's character despite their troubles, but also the dangers of succumbing to, you know, not looking after oneself, so that one's genius becomes toxic to you. Because that's how I understand this thing. You know, your genius is this unique style and talent that we're all born with, and that is a gift. But a gift that is not utilised becomes a burden. And yeah, I hope that this impresses on anyone who might be listening, or who cares, the question of whether or not we're really getting in tune with our genius, and what kind of effect is it having on our lives. I know that myself, for instance, in the last 10 years or so, in many ways I have neglected my own unique style and talent, and just been sort of seeing myself as trying to fit into an idea of normality that just doesn't suit me. I'm far too abnormal to be able to get away with pretending that I'm normal for long. And so I suppose this is also very sensitive to me, because I'm trying to come out of that phase of trying to fit in, which is crazy at the age of 50 years old. So anyway, today I'm celebrating the beauty and the genius of my older brother, Duncan John Powell.